Welcome back. If you're just joining us, it's Daybreak on Trust Television, and it's time that we take a deep dive into our major discussions this morning. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu last night unveiled his cabinet of close advisors, political loyalists, to the world as he seeks to rejuvenate the nation's faltering economy and other challenges facing Nigeria, as well as respond to the crisis in neighboring Niger that has dominated the first few months of his term in office. The incoming cabinet has an investment banker, Wale, Edun, as finance and coordinating minister of the economy, in a sweeping role responsible for rebooting the battered finances of Africa's most populous nation. President Tinubu has former River State Governor Nyesom Wike emerging as Minister of Federal Capital Territory, the first Southern minister since the return of democracy in 1999. There is also the coordinating Minister of Health and Social Welfare and the person of Dr. Ali Pati, while the Transportation Ministry has been split into two to former governors who will mind the Ministry of Defense, with former Jigawa State Governor Badru Abubakar emerging the senior minister and former Zamfara State Governor Matawali, Minister of State. The Petroleum Ministry is to have two ministers of state. Heineke Lekobiri is now Minister of State Petroleum, while Ekpo is Minister of State Gas Resources. These and more forms the thrust of our discussion on Daybreak Show this morning. We have in the studio Emeka Oji. It's a pleasure to have you, Emeka.
Thank you.
Emeka is a finance and development strategist, former assistant country director of the United States African Development Foundation. And we also have in the studio Chukwuma Chinye, who is a political researcher at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you very much.
All right. We also have joining us via Zoom from the Sunshine States in Adama, the Dr. Agosu Bameyi. Bameyi is a professional counselor, life coach, motivator, writer, publisher, speaker, and social entrepreneur. It goes on and on and on. It's a pleasure to have you all join us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Yesterday, it does appear that we finally hit the ground running with the assigning of portfolios to what appears to be the biggest cabinet size that we have had in our recent history, if not all of our history, if you like. To start with you, Oji, were there surprises? Were you pleased with what you saw yesterday? What were your first impressions when those portfolios, those announcements were made?
Thank you very much for having me again. The very first thing that hit me was digital economy. So, Bosu to digital economy, square peg and square hole. I think that is a signal that Mr. President's administration is interested in building that space, and that is a space that can generate an alternative economy for this country, and we definitely, desperately need alternative economies. We are largely a mono economy. A single product is responsible for about 80% of our forex earning. That is not sustainable, especially given the hole and space that we currently are in. So anything that diversifies our national income, especially our national forex income, is a very welcome development. Digital economy and that IT space is one of those major areas that can lead this diversification. So I was very happy to see Bosu there. That is one. Two, I was happy to see Nyesom Wike in FCT. I know this is going to sound controversial to some, but I was happy.
Not necessarily, but go ahead.
On the average, most people we spoke to yesterday seem to have been impressed with his. I mean, if you think of what the Federal Capital City has become lately, everywhere overtaken by refuse dump, simple provision of streetlights became a major infrastructure we battling with for more than 8 years. You would think we needed somebody in the frame of the Eastwide Nasir El-Rufai.
Exactly. I was just going to go there. I wrote an article last week which was basically, whose thrust was basically bring El-Rufai back. You know, and I said, sitting right here about 2 weeks ago, I said that Abuja residents look with nostalgia to the times of El-Rufai. You ask your Abuja residents, and I'm sure that we may dislike his politics, like I do personally. I dislike his politics, but I am not one to say he didn't work. He's a guy who gets things done, and I miss him in that ministerial list, because I would have liked him to get the power ministry or the energy ministry, as has been touted, and then he either fails or he succeeds. If he succeeds, we get something we've been looking for in this country since. If he fails, then his rumored presidential aspiration comes to a screeching halt, is over. So I liked Wike in FCT for two reasons. One, he's another person who gets things done. Yeah, you know, he may not be the most suave person, may not be the most gentlemanly of people, but he gets things done. That's one. The second thing is, can a Southerner be FCT minister for once? He's the first Southerner that is going to be FCT minister. So,
do you think that really matters in the grand scheme of things?
It doesn't matter to me because of competency. I think that competency should drive everything. But we are in Nigeria. We are in Nigeria. We are all witnesses to how divided we are, and how Nigerians believe that certain people cannot sit in certain positions. I am Igbo, as you can imagine by my name. Yeah, there are lots of people in Nigeria that believe that Igbo cannot sit on that presidential seat. Yeah, so I hope I'm not getting sensitive.
That's fine.
I'm not touching sensitive spaces.
These are all fault lines that exist.
Yeah, so Nyesom Wike sitting on that seat it breaks the mold. It tells people that things can change. It gives me some hope that one day, you know, perhaps another part of the country would be the leading voices in the security infrastructure of this country. If you look at the setup again, the two ministers of defense are from a certain part of the country, and they have had a lot of cases against them. Let me put it that way. I am actually surprised that Mr. President put those two individuals in Ministry of Defense and Ministry of State Defense. That is one of my surprises. I love that Ali Pate is in defense. And I love the coordinating that was put before his name. I think that what it means is that he's not just doing health. I think it means that perhaps he would also be in charge of, I don't know, but perhaps he would also be in charge of the humanitarian affairs.
I think Battered is there to coordinate the humanitarian services that has been birthed by the Buhari administration. But we're going to take a moment before we segue into all of the other talking points as far as the formation of the next cabinet of the federal government is concerned. We'll take a moment's break. We're back in just a moment. Join us again.
Residents of the Federal Capital Territory are hereby alerted to the activities of scavengers, also known as Babambula, which security agencies have identified as a high-level security threat to not only the residents but also to our infrastructure, as they perpetrate petty stealing and acts of vandalism on public utilities. More so, they are drug peddlers, serve as spies to terrorist elements, and are ready-made tools for the public disturbances, during which they attack people with dangerous weapons. The Federal Capital Territory Administration therefore reiterates that the ban on scavengers, aka Bababula, operating within the Federal Capital City is still in force. These miscreants are advised to stay off the streets of the Federal Capital City for their own good, as defaulters will be apprehended and prosecuted, including parents of underage children involved in these practices. Relevant agencies are carrying out enforcement of this ban as stipulated. Be law-abiding always. Let's together build the FCT of our dreams. Management announcer.
All right, welcome back to the program. You're still watching Daybreak on Trust TV. We're actually just getting things started about the portfolios that the ministers designate have been given already. The announcement was made. The release from the Office of the Secretary to the Government of the Federation announced the various portfolios, and some of them are head-turners, some of them not so much, square pegs and square holes in a lot of these areas, and the opinions vary actually about what the capacity of some of these individuals are and the potential of them getting the job done as far as what Nigeria needs. So we're actually just getting the conversation started with our three guests, one via Zoom. Dr. Aguso joining us all the way from Yola this morning. So before we get to Dr. Aguso, I'd like to get your own take on the representation for young Nigerians particularly. I do have a little bit of bias in that. There were a handful of them during the screening that were visible, but the concern that most Nigerians had was that, what are the chances that the administration could relegate them to some sort of secondary role in the cabinet? It does appear that some of them are getting, full-fledged ministries to spearhead. What are your thoughts about the representation of youths in the administration vis-a-vis the positions they have been given so far?
Well, thank you for having me again. I think one of the key things to note, though, is I slightly disagree with your position because the key ministries obviously have gone to seasoned professionals or former governors, seasoned politicians. We have Wale Edun in the Ministry of Finance and Economy. That's a very sweeping role, really, which I agree with. We have, as we said, Meta Wale and for the defense. I do think that it is what Tinubu has done is a step definitely in the right direction, and it's good to see if these people would work in the portfolios they have been given. I do have concerns, however, with some of the other the potential for some young people to have been placed in perhaps better positions. So, for instance, as controversial as it might sound, I don't agree with Festus Keyama's portfolio, as he has no intellectual basis to be given that sort of position. That might have gone to somebody with maybe.
Why do you say that?
Well, for aerospace and giving his former positions first he has held as for Minister of State for Labour and Employment, as well as his general background, I felt like that position, because things like that are usually very research intensive, you're sort of trying to break the barrier, especially for a country like Nigeria, where something like that is not. We don't have a very strong, it's not very strong in this country. So I thought that might have gone to somebody either with.
Is there anybody on the list who could fit that role much more perfectly? Perhaps
not.
Right.
Perhaps not. But it's fair enough to say that at this stage. But even before we got to the nominations and the screenings, perhaps there could have been a better use of that position if Tinubu is serious about developing our aerospace and improving our aviation industry in Nigeria, because that's something that is overlooked. I feel I can't think of anyone right now, so maybe the argument is pointless. But
when we talk about development in that space, what should we be concerned about? Is it about somebody who is a professional in that space or somebody who is a manager? Because the supporting agencies seem to have the requisite professionals in place who can provide advisory. What we have lacked over the years is good some kind of synergy and administration, the right kind of, because we've had precedents before. I mean, the immediate past Minister of Aviation was a pilot, or still a pilot. And when we begin to wonder what value he brought to that space in nearly 8 years, so in the face of those kind of argument, do we need to stick, primarily with somebody from that space?
Well, it depends. Why I am picking that specifically is the addition of the aerospace, right? Keyamo is not just Minister for Aviation; it's also the aerospace bit. What I was trying to point out is that Nigeria, in that particular, where we're lacking in any form of aerospace technology, aerospace development. So whilst the former minister might have been a pilot, I understand that the role is purely, managerial. We have FAN, we have a lot of the other organizations who are doing a very good job. Particularly, there's been marked improvements over the last 10, 15 years. So what I was trying to say was maybe perhaps proper technocrats might have been needed in that position if you were adding aerospace development.
There is a sense that, it's the president's prerogative. We've not seen much of it lately as far as reshuffling of the cabinet is concerned, but it is something that the president can do during the course of the life of this particular administration. But if we can bring in Dr. Agus Obame into the conversation to weigh in on some of these talking points. Doctor, thank you once again for joining us on the program. Many Nigerians have been eagerly waiting for this announcement. It has come about, but are you surprised that the swearing-in has been deferred until next week? And what are your initial thoughts about the various positions for the various ministers designate?
Thank you for having me. And it's nice to see you, Ahmed, after a while. Well, I personally expected that we should have gone beyond the swearing in of ministers. You know, during politicking and those days after elections, my thinking was that we would have worked on the ministers, and as soon as he takes office, he would have announced it. But fortunately, he delayed. I know it's because of political tug of war, pullings here and there, trying to balance things out so he can have a smooth presidency, which is always the case in Nigeria. But it's usually not good for us as a country that we have such long delays before we have ministers announced. I mean, the country will not function without ministers in place. Basically, nothing can be done. But having said that, let me say here that I have a lot of hope for a lot of these ministers. My thinking is that they will get things done this time around. And there are two reasons why I'm saying this. First of all, after the campaigning and the nature of the campaigning and the issues that were brought to the campaign table by opposition parties, especially the Labour Party, and I'm not campaigning for him, but I'm saying that he brought up issues that even though they didn't win the presidency, my feeling was whoever became the president cannot ignore. It became very clear from what the young people did and how they went about it, that it's no longer going to be business as usual. We've got to face our issues, we've got to solve our problems, and we've got to move this country forward. We have stagnated for too long. So my expectation is that for that reason, the president and his cabinet will perform. The second reason is that a lot of them are experienced, and they're not looking for name or anything anymore. And I think that they would like to go down, they would like to be seen by Nigerians as people who have performed. And a lot of them also are in positions that they would really do well. Take Nyesom Wike, for instance. And I think we would always talk about this character. But I'm excited that he's in the FCT, because in the last set of governors, it's nobody performed as much as he did, and I think that in the FCT he would work. He's in the right place. Education is very close to my heart, and I'm excited to see that it's an educationist, Professor Tahir Mamman, that is in that position. My hope is that for those reasons, because we have people who have a desire to perform and have been given assignments that are within their scope, within their influence, that we will see performance this time around. It's not just politics, but performance.
Right. Okay. If we bringing it back here to the studio, thank you very much, Dr. Aguso, for that concise take. The expectations are quite high, and I must say that Nigerians are not necessarily new to being let down by not just their expectations, but by the people they believe have the capacity to get the job done. Case in point, 2015. I mean, I speak for most people when I say the expectations were this high, but the performance did not come close to the expectations for the Buhari administration, especially when he came first in 2015. What are your thoughts about how we can manage those expectations? Because You look at the global economy right now. There's a bit of contraction. The two most dominant economies in the world, China and the United States, are not doing particularly well right now. How much can we realistically expect things to change vis-a-vis what is going on outside of Nigeria, and also factoring in some of the issues we have around the country, insecurity, the rising poverty, the forex situation, and all of these things? How much can they realistically deliver for Nigerians?
So let's start from the international and then come to the domestic. COVID-19, as it was tagged, caused a slowdown in the world economy. You know, supply chain management issues, movement of transportation lines, goods couldn't get from China out, Vietnam out, you know. That caused a slowdown in the world economy. As the world was coming out of that, Russia and Ukraine went into what they went into, and the interesting thing is that between Russia and Ukraine is a lot of, is about 40% or more of the world's grain supplies. So that hit the world badly. And that has, all these have come together to cause inflation all around the world. Nigeria is not exempt from that, and so there is that issue. So let's pack that at the back of our mind and come local. 2015, there's a lot of expectation, yes. 2023, there is not a lot of expectation. Relative to 2015. And that is one thing that President Bola Tinubu'S administration has going for it. That people really don't expect much from him.
You think?
Yes. Yes. Comparative to 2015, people don't expect much from him.
But the stakes are high, regardless of the expectations, right?
The stakes are over high. He's sitting on a keg of gunpowder. If he goes wrong, if he missteps, we could end up as a statistic. This country could end up as a statistic. So, yes, the stakes are much, much higher than they were in 2015, much, much higher than they were in 2019, but he doesn't have the social capital of expectation that existed in 2015. He doesn't have it. He didn't even make, the figures that...
The percentages were some of the lowest.
The figures that INEC threw out, he didn't make over 50%. So there's not a lot of people banking on him. So that gives him a slight advantage. I note, there's something I note in, I don't know how many people have seen it, but there's something I note in his ministerial appointees. I note that the spaces that are, let me call them blue oceans. I was having a conversation with Chukwu earlier, and we spoke about blue oceans. Yeah, you spoke about blue economy, I spoke about blue oceans. Right. Yeah. So there's a difference.
Can we unpack what you're trying to say? Blue economy is a relatively known term. What about blue oceans? What are you referring to?
Okay, so the blue economy is, there's a Ministry of Blue Economy, right?
That's right.
So the blue economy is,
water space,
marine, what is in the water, what is under the water, how can we build economies around that and livelihoods around that. That is the blue economy. Blue oceans, however, are untested grounds. Spaces that hold potential for growth, economic growth, that have not been stepped into yet. Blue oceans in Nigeria include the digital economy. They include tourism. They include mines. They include
tourism.
Solid minerals, arts and culture, aerospace, ecology and environment. These are all blue oceans. If you look at the people that are sitting on these blue oceans, most of them are his loyalists. Most of them are his loyalists.
And what does that suggest?
It suggests one of two things to me. And this is an or and. It's not an either or. It's an or and. It could be one, that he is so interested in them, he's so interested in growing them, that he needs people he believes most in their capacity, and he has given that to them. That is on the one part. On the second part, it could also mean that he has seen ahead, and he sees that those are critically resourced spaces that nobody will be looking at, and that there's room for clearance.
Interesting.
If you get what I mean.
All right, Chinye. Sorry, I keep mixing up your name, so let me apologize in advance. In advance. He said some things that are critical, but I would like you to speak to two things. The first is, beside this competency, how would you evaluate the balancing acts that took place? You know, at first, when those 48 lists came out, some region had just 5 names. But in delegating ministries, he brought out 4 substantive ministers from those regions, and 1 minister of states. There are places that had 10, but had more of minister of states than there are substantive minister. What do you speak to? Because that's also a critical factor. If you take into account the fact that we are a multifaceted society and people read meaning to just about everything. To take ownership of this process, people need to see themselves in whatever form, religion, culture, and all, reflected in the dynamics of their appointment. That's one. 2, I would like you to speak to some of the bold decisions you saw. Because when we saw that the list had about 9 governors, we were imagining with the kind of clout they had as governors coming into the cabinet, they would not settle for anything less than a minister of state. But today, we are seeing former governors nominated as minister of states, and people who are just stepping into this terrain for the first time with no political clout ending up as substantive ministers. I mean, you talked about young people. If you take away the finance minister, the lady in industry, trade and investment, which is a massive untapped space, by the way. Better Edun, give it to her, young, energetic, and has been around that space for her. What do you say to these two things? Yeah.
I think, first of all, I think one thing you have to credit Tinubu with is getting the balancing act fairly right. I would say so. I was looking at the list earlier today and geographic distribution. And as you have rightly said, so for instance, you have Wike in FCT from the South, which is a substantive position. You have the petroleum and natural gas, both of them are from the southern regions. You have Daybreak, southeast as well, in a good position. But I think, obviously, we had the southwest. I think still dominates a lot of southwest, and I think the northwest dominates a lot of those positions. You have key portfolios, defense, the economy. Those are largely relegated to the southwest and the northwest. But I think he has tried to placate all the regions, and I think in the post-2023 election climate that we currently are in, it is very important, and it was very important that he got it a bit right. That's not to say people are not going to still have complaints, because as from the southeast, I think most people from that region would naturally just do feel aggrieved by the nature of only having 5 numbers from that position. And to answer your second question, I think that what Tinubu has done really is how do I put this? He was going to do whatever he was going to do. I don't know if that makes sense.
You don't think he's discerning and reading the room across the country?
As I said, he has done that in the balancing act, in the way he has sort of spread across the various portfolios. But I think there's still some very bold decisions in there. I don't think there's nothing that anybody would have said that would have changed some of those. I think he has done a great job of kind of putting technocrats, but also his loyalists, people who so if we are being honest, Wike should not be in his government as a minister, given where he's coming from as a governor of the opposition party. You might argue that he's also reaching across to the other party, but Wike himself is not in the good graces of PDP.
That's right.
So it is clearly a move, originated from Wike's loyalty to him. So he has put people who he can count on, people loyalists to him, but also done it in such a way that you look at some of the
Antecedents.
the antecedents and also some of the positions, you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was an ambassador to Germany. You have the Ministry of Finance, a former, former commissioner, seasoned economist. In some of those positions, he has actually put people who, if you look at their backgrounds, they should work in the economy. But also, you have your Festus Kayamos, your Wikes.
When you talk about background, just before Abdul comes in, just to use a football team as an analogy, you can get a team of 24 top-of-the-range players, and the season could be completely messed up because you probably don't have a coach.
I'll tell you about that as a Chelsea fan.
Well, I'm a Chelsea fan as well. I'm a Liverpool fan, so you can imagine what stakes we have.
We share the same stories.
So, and you get messed up by the quality of a coach or lack of strategy. How do we, with these kind of big names, with these huge portfolios, with people with proven track records from where they are coming from? I mean, Ali Partey at Gavi and his antecedents speaks for him. How do we get to a point where we can design KPIs that everybody can hold these guys to the fire and say, I mean, from the word go, don't go in there and begin to do guesswork around what needs to be done or not done. We are not saying there are no space for innovations and all of that, but for the power ministry, like you mentioned, we want you to deliver on expanding transmission infrastructure that is practicable in the next 3 years, and whatever we deploy will be to this man. As we find in the private sector, you come in and you have a set of KPIs and they hold you to the fire on that. How can we get to the level where we can begin to pin these people down? Because we've seen in the last administration, ministers, we can't even remember one thing they did in the space of 8. And by the way, they did same for 4 years and got rewarded for another 4 years. And people who we saw elements of movement were the ones who were taken out and replaced with, how do we begin to move away from those times?
One of the first things to note is, I think if we learn lessons from the previous administration, is that a big man does not guarantee performance. I think some ministries have a tendency to swallow. I'm trying to remember, I can't remember, former governor of Lagos State, who, sorry, please, if you... Fashola, thank you very much. Who I, at times, during the last 4 years, I completely forgot that the man was a minister because there was nothing he was doing, especially with his performance that was widely praised as the governor of Lagos State. So, as somebody who works in, I'm not in the private space, but I'm also not in the public, as somebody who works in development. KPI is very important.
That's right.
The ability to say, okay, this is a project, this is the budget, and we're going to go and deliver.
These are the timelines.
These are the timelines. What you're speaking to actually speaks to one of the very fabrics of Nigerian society, which is the ability for us citizens to hold our elected or appointed officials to account. And it's something that is extremely difficult to do, that we have tried and at most times failed to do so. So one of the things going forward is we need the civil servants also to be empowered in their roles, in their several ministers, because these ministers have to work with. And also the president himself, as busy as I can imagine he will be, has to take an active role in, particularly for the key, I think I'll call it maybe the big 3 or the big 4 portfolios. We have our, obviously economy, defense,
energy,
definitely. Even foreign affairs, given the way things are happening, the way West Africa is
unraveling
really, in Niger and all of these things. So it is he has a very big role to play, but also the empowerment of several parastatals and civil servants to be able to actually because there's a lot of very intelligent people in those spaces who are just stuck, unable to implement ideas.
Okay, Dr. August, so bringing you back into the conversation, and thank you for your patience. You can imagine that we have 3 guests to navigate this morning. What kind of principle should President Bola Tinubu be to these new ministers? I mean, some of them have big personalities. I can imagine it will be tough to handle them, especially when they don't agree on certain things. So what kind of principle should he be to maximize their utility in service to Nigerians?
He should be a principle that is present. you shouldn't just let them off and go on, boys, do whatever you want to do, whatever you have to do. No. He should be there, keep an eye on them, question them, find out how far they are doing, how well they are doing, what needs to be done, and all that. And he should be able to back work he's given them with money. I mean, we know in Nigeria you have ministries and extra ministerial agencies and all that, and they come up with their plans, their budget, and we have budget announcements. But at the end of the day, releases are not done. So people sit with great ideas, but no money with which to work. We have to look at that, because it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter your intentions, how good they are. If the money with which to work is not available, you would only appear in office and enjoy the air conditioning and those long meetings and go away, and Nigerians will see nothing done practically. Let me say something here, a little bit away from our general discussion, but it's still relevant. We've been talking and we've not said much about education. We are sitting as a country. President is sitting on a, but as a country, we are standing our education area is going to solve the problem in the education. Nigerians are out, and our
Dr. Agoso, if you can
annually is also dropping.
Dr. Agoso, if you can hear me, I think
challenges all kinds of difficulties in,
and we can barely make sense of what you
have to do something about this.
We'll circle back and get your thoughts on developing the education sector, which I think is also very important. But we need to work on that connection because the audio is poor at the moment. But if you can chime in here, what sort of principle should he be to these ministers to maximize utility, but also to deliver on his renewed hope agenda?
I note that there are two ministers that have 2 out of the 46 that have coordinating in their title. One of them is Wale Edun, the other is Alipate. Interestingly, there are 2 of 7 that I find very interesting. And I believe will deliver. I believe that part of his structure would be to pass off a lot to those 2 that have coordinating in their titles. I may be wrong, but if I were him, that is one thing I would do.
The last time we tried it, it worked somewhat. Didn't it?
Dr. Wale?
I would say it worked somewhat, yes. Dr. Wale, yes, like you rightly mentioned. I think that with petroleum, I suspect that with petroleum resources, that what he may do is that he would retain the ministerial position. And
does that still make sense in present-day Nigeria today?
Given that,
in light of everything that is happening with removal of fuel subsidy, the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act, does it still make sense for the president to be in charge of that ministry? I do not think
that it ever makes sense for a president to be in charge of any ministry at all. That is my personal opinion, because the president has enough work already, and the concept of a ministry is delegation. So if you say you're not going to delegate a particular ministry, then I wonder why. Yeah, but he didn't mention. So that's likely what he's going to do.
At any rate, you cannot take critical decision without the clearance from council. But
yes.
If we put that side by side, I'm also trying to make sense of that. What's so special about wanting to continue to retain? I mean, Obasanjo did it. We're not sure what came out of it. The Edun and Jonathan gave it up. Well, at the tail end of his administration, he brought in Lukman and allowed him. But then Yaradua gave it out substantially, was it Jonathan to Alice Madueke? Right. And this last government did the same thing, and I can't understand the rationale behind wanting to be a president and the minister. And we saw how that circled into the delegation and all of that when the GMD of the NNPC can just walk past the Minister of State, who is chairman of his board, and go get approvals without the knowledge of the order to expend $25 billion, and the other one will just get to read from the pages of the newspaper. How does that work?
So I think it has to be one of three things. Yeah, it has to be that there's either a lot of technicality involved in that space, or that there's a lot of politics involved in that space, or that there's a lot of resources and money involved in that space. Obviously. We know that there's not too much technicality involved in that space. Even if there was, Mr. Tinubu is not exactly the most technical in that type of area. So that can be why.
Even though he has been an accountant.
Yes, that can be why. He has a lot to do as and politics, well, it can't also be. So this must be about resources and the control of resources.
Right. Okay. I think we have Dr. Aguso back, and hopefully the connection would not hinder his thoughts this time around. Dr. Aguso, thank you very much for staying with us. Go ahead and finish your line of thought, please.
So my thinking is this: we want a country that works for us all, and at my age now, I'm actually working for to have a country that works for my children. You know, I've been at the top of a mountain. I'm going downhill at my age. But before I go, I would like to see a country that works for everybody, everyone. And it's while all the sectors are important, and I don't want to belittle any, we have to understand that the fulcrum upon which everything else turns is education. And the educational situation in Nigeria right now is an emergency. Over 20 million children out of school. We have over 4 million street kids. And that 20 million that I mentioned, over half of them are girls. And we're talking about equality between boys and girls. The way we can bridge that gap is through education. Unfortunately, girls are suffering in this particular situation. It's through education that we will produce the engineers, the doctors, and all other professions that we need to get our country into a situation where it's not a monoproduct country anymore, but has multiple streams of income, and it's doing well in all factors. So my expectation is that, you know, what I always say is that if the president will assign himself a ministry so he can supervise it, it should not be that of petroleum resources. We need to know that the world is moving away from fossil fuels. And so not long from now, we will sit on so much fossil fuel and not have market for it. However, if the president should appoint himself as a minister so as to supervise personally, more closely, it should be education, you know, and we put in resources there and train the trainers, the teachers, you know, put in the facilities across the country, you know, so that we balance out the disparity between the urban and the rural centers, and be able to share the resources equally. It's education that will ensure that, you know, that we deal with the huge poverty in our country. You know, over 133 million Nigerians out of the 200 million plus are living below the poverty line. How do you bridge the gap? Again, is through education. Those poor people, their children, the only way their children can break off from the cycle of poverty is through education. So I think that this should be brought to the attention of the president, whereas we want to grow, we want to develop in all these areas that we're talking about. And it's good that we have people who can do this work. It is important that we begin to give education the emphasis that it needs so that we can truly build a country that works for us all and that lives up to its potential.
All right. Dr. Aguso, just before we come back to the studio, I would like you to speak to the issue of coordination. We once were talking with the former economic advisor to Obasanjo, who had mentioned how ministers naturally like the idea of coordination in terms of synergy, but are not disposed to the idea of cooperation, because at that level, their egos begin to come in about subordinating their ideas to somebody else and all of that. Because at the end of the day, if we have these people working at cross purposes and not understanding how whatever they do fits into the action of the other person, we may just have people driving in different directions, and that's in a way stagnation. How does this president build that coordination element? I know he appointed a special advisor in Addis Ababa in what appears supposed to be a monitoring and evaluation unit, that reports back to him. How do we begin to weave this rope around how they should function and how everybody should have his eye fixed on a common goal?
Number one, the president should exemplify this. And that's why I said he should be present and in each of the ministries. Number two, it is very important that we understand that it's not about us. The ministers should understand it's not about them. It's not about their egos. It's about the country. It's about getting things done and getting them done well. And we cannot get things done well if we do not cooperate among ourselves and coordinate our activities. A good example is what we see in the security sector. The police is on its own. DSS is on its own. Everybody is just doing his own thing. So that intel that will help is not shared among them. And at the end of the day, it's the citizens that suffer. So cooperation and coordination is important. We also know that without monitoring and evaluation, you're not going anywhere. You just be working, whether it has an impact or it has a positive result or not. You don't know. You're just doing it, and that's how we keep throwing money into a deep hole and have no results. So we should get to a point in this country where we allow ourselves to be monitored and evaluated, what they call peer review, and so that your work is looked at by somebody else and you look at somebody else's work and we get the feedback. That will help us, will help the ministers to sit up and do their work properly. Again, I repeat what I said. It's not about them individually. It's not about their political ambitions. I know some of them push to become ministers because 2027 they want to run for governor, or 2037 they want to run for president. It's not about that. It's about getting things done. And without monitoring and evaluation, without proper coordination and cooperation between the various agencies and ministries, we cannot do much.
Okay. Bringing up the conversation back here, a very good point about without the synergy and coordination. Obviously, there are some of these ministers designate who feel this is a compensation for the good work they did in the 2023 presidential campaign. Mm-hmm. So this is their reward, more or less. And it remains to be seen how they're going to allow that to translate into service to Nigerians. But as far as the political side of the conversation is, because we understand the pressures that is coming from different stakeholders who are saying, listen, this is not what we signed up for. The president's election is not what we entirely endorse. And this is not entirely the full list in itself. You see someone like Erufai stepping down because of, obviously, it's not an ideal situation. He doesn't like the fact that he, alongside two others, have been singled out for more investigation into their nomination as ministers of the federal government. But also, in talking about some of those deliverables, we have to consider the lean resources. We're not in an economically healthy position where you can say, listen, every ministry can have X amount of money in its budget to do whatever it can. And that's what Dr. Agoso was pointing out earlier, that without the resources, none of those ideas could come to light, really. But also that's another aspect of our leadership, isn't it? Being resourceful. What are your thoughts about how some of these ministers can be resourceful, especially within the legislation that we do have, to make sure that they get the funds they need to actualize President Tinubu's renewed hope?
I think, to just briefly digress, I think to start with, one of the things that would have helped would be probably from Tinubu himself, a streamlining of some of these portfolios. I say so because at 46, it's bulky. There's a lot of ministerial positions.
Well, that's not the end, though.
Yeah, we're still expecting.
Yeah, we're still
expecting more.
Yeah.
There's a lot. For me, I was looking at the list again. There's a bit of duplication. Why do you need the Minister of Water, and then you have one for blue economy, for example? You have Edun, Wale Edun, who has been put as sweeping minister for economy, but yeah, we still have trade, investment. We have a ministry for that. So I think perhaps
you think there's a lot of overlap?
It's a bit of it might not be completely overlapping, but there's some definitely duplication. I'll call it a duplication of efforts. There's definitely some things in both of those ministries or four of those ministries I've mentioned that they'll be doing exactly the same thing.
That's right.
Exactly the same thing, and they are, as different ministries, require their own specific budgets to carry out these activities. So from a starting point, I think there should have been, from Tinubu himself, sort of, I was perhaps hoping before the list actually came out, that he would depart from former President Buhari's very bulky list of ministers and go for something a bit more streamlined. That hasn't happened. So where we find ourselves now is we have 46, perhaps 47, 48, 49 separate, and each of them would require significant, as Professor has said, amounts of. So I think, to answer your question directly, it depends on the individual, really. Someone like Wike, for example, might find it easier to be resourceful because of the deliverables he might have for the FCT. Perhaps his goals might be purely, infrastructural, for example. Repairing this road.
We're already hearing, pardon the interruption, that the FCDA has earmarked 500 buildings that it wants to destroy. Without, do you expect Wike to be as ruthless as El-Rufai was, or even more?
Yes, I do. If you look at his track record in Rivers State, I think wherever he pointed to any of his achievements was purely to the building and destruction of infrastructure. Clearing this road, doing this one, building this road, building this overpass bridge or that. So I think that probably would be his legacy here in the FCT. I expect him to, a lot of the, I think there's, even regarding things like IDP camps in the FCT, yes, I think it might be very controversial. You might see him clearing some of those as well. You might see him clearing some of the more illegal, mini communities that are
the shacks,
shacks, shanty towns that are scattered around the Federal Capital Territory. So it largely depends on the portfolio. I expect some of the lesser known, actually, just to go back to what he was saying, some of the more blue oceans to get actually less funding. Things like blue economy, things like the digital economy might get a bit less of money to invest in there, because there's no, for the government, there's key, if I were Tinubu, to secure my legacy and to be seen as somebody who is doing well as a president, there's only two things he needs to do. Just two. It's the economy and security, defense. Just if he's investing a lot of Nigeria's budget into those
areas.
Those areas, a lot of Nigerians will say he's doing well, regardless of anything else that happens in the country.
Especially security.
Yes.
But do we see an alignment in what the president has done so far to suggest that he's living in this reality that resources are lean? For instance, especially with some of the committees that he has set up already, one has the difficult task of setting an agenda that sees us executing 18% tax to GDP, which is, for most economies, unrealistic, because even the much bigger economies are struggling to be able to attain similar, heights. What are your thoughts about how some of the things he has done so far is indicative of what we might likely see going forward, especially with some of the policies that he is implementing right now?
First of all, Mr. Tinubu is running a bloated government. We see it in his ministers and the ministries that he has created, 48 of them. And we see it in some of the type of committees that you referred to. But I would like to speak a bit to resourcing. Finding funds. You have these ministers, you have these ministries. how do you locate the resources to do what you need to do? There are only two ways to locate resources. You are either taking or you are creating. Yeah?
He did say that he's moving away from borrowing, so I suppose he's creating now.
I'm talking of the ministers. I'm not talking of the president and the presidency. I'm talking of ministers. And that was the last question that Chukwuma delved into. You are either taking, so you're waiting for your allocations and the money that is given to your ministry. You are either taking or you are creating. So let's ditch or let's forget the taking a bit. Yeah, Chukwuma has dealt with that. Let's talk about creating. A lot of these ministers, these current ministers, do not know they can create resources. So they would sit on their palms and their hands and wait for government to feed them. But you can create resources. 3 major ways of doing that. Number 1 is development of social capital so that you can leverage human resources. Religious institutions do it, right? So that's why churches can get their members to donate free labor, free human resource to build churches. But they have to believe in what you're doing. So you have to create an environment where people believe in you enough to invest their time and resource to get your project rolling. That is a way to create resource. The second way is to actually go out and find grants. I'm not now talking of loans. I'm talking of grants.
Or equity, if you like.
Or equity. Thank you. Grant and equity, which can help your space. The last time I was here, I spoke about the climate industry. Yeah? Energy transition. There's a lot of money out there for energy transition. Can we download, especially the ones that have little to do with loans? Can we download the grants and get into equity positions and equity deals? That's one. Then we look at enterprise development, MSMEs. MSMEs, I keep repeating, they produce 50% of our GDP, 90% of our employment. Anything that produces 50% of your GDP and 90% of your employment is a gold mine. And there's money out there to develop MSMEs. You can find grants internationally. I'm talking of hundreds of millions of dollars. So you can locate these monies if you know what to do and where to go.
That's the ideal situation, right? You're talking about former governors who for the past 8 years didn't have to do any outside of the box thinking, but wait for federal allocation. Why should they change now?
Why they should change is 2 reasons.
Let me reframe the question. Okay. Do you believe they have the incentive to change and do some outside of the box thinking as ministers of the federal government?
That's why I pointed out some ministries that were in what I would call some emergent, let me use that word for them, some emergent or emerging ministries. I used the term blue oceans before. Those blue oceans, that's actually where there is a lot of room to play, because the people there, I would assume, have a slightly different mindset from, let's say, the people that are sitting in budget and national planning, or the people that are sitting in defense. You know, those ones can go out and raise funds. I said 3 things. So one is leverage human resourcing. The second is leverage grants. And then the third is leverage partnerships. There are treaties. There are bilateral relationships out there to be leveraged. Nigeria is signatory to 365 treaties. 365. How many of them are we really leveraging? We haven't been very good.
Okay, we are really running out of time. It's been a wonderful conversation. I wish we had room to even evaluate issues around the kind of signals we have sent to the world with this appointment, because perception is really very important if the foreign direct investments will come in. I also wanted to take your pick, Dr. Agoso, but we are out of time, on the political implication of not having substantive ministers from states like Borno and Kano. That's the politics side of what has happened, but I'm sure we'll find time to do this another time. Thank you very much, Inye, for always finding time to be here and sharing your very insightful perspective with our viewers. Thank you very much, my brother Oji. You come with very, how do I call it, sparkling insights, and I'm sure these guys should have you as advisors to them on how they can think outside the box. And thank you very much, Doctor, for finding time to always be part of this show and all you bring to refresh our viewers at home. This is the much that time would permit us. We have to allow these gentlemen go look for others, look for ways of sustaining livelihood. I think times are getting very tough. We'll take a quick breather. When we return, the show continues. Please don't go away.